Sheriff's Office, emergency.
It's Emerald Sands. And my manager said to call you.
I had her desk call me and tell me that they heard multiple gunshots coming from a room. So I went down there, and all I did was put the key in the door, open the door, and everything's covered in blood.
And there was 2 females that had been murdered in the hotel room. One was on the floor, one was on the bed.
There was numerous amounts of spent .38 shell casing. Alicia Greer was 31 years old, and Jacqueline Moore, her friend, was 39.
By all accounts, Alicia Greer was a very loving person. She always had a smile on her face. She was very friendly. She was a mother of 3 children and also very forgiving. She had a heart of gold, is how her friend described her. Billy Boyette and Alicia Greer started dating around Thanksgiving of 2016. Billy Boyette was violent toward Alicia quite often, choked her, kicked her in the face. He actually split her head open with an unopened 2-liter bottle of Coke. From speaking with a close friend of Alicia Greer's, she just needed a place to get away and hide from him until that could happen. Jacqueline was actively trying to help her hide from Billy Boyette, and that's why she was at the motel that day. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, trying to help Alicia in any way that she could.
Santa Rosa County Sheriff's Office were able to contact witnesses there at the hotel, and they give a description of the vehicle that Billy Boyette was known to be in, a rented 2016 black Ford Edge SUV. And that's what he was last seen leaving the Emerald Sands with.
Obviously, he becomes a prime suspect fairly quickly.
According to Mary Rice's mother, who had the children that belonged to Mary Rice, she had not heard from Mary, which was not normal for her.
She was a mother of 3. She was doing the best she could as a single mother, worked at a local Dollar General to try to make ends meet.
Based upon the statements that were made by the family of Mary Rice, they were concerned about her safety because she would not have abandoned her children. We were alerted about how Billy was known to hang out within Mary Rice's area. So there is a good possibility that Billy Boyette is involved.
We now have a manhunt on for Billy Boyette.
This quiet neighborhood in Milton flooded with police vehicles to search for Billy Boyette. No luck.
You need to be afraid. You need to be scared.
In the early morning hours, we were notified of another homicide in Baldwin County, just across the state line there in Lillian, Alabama.
A lady named Peggy Brose was found deceased in her own driveway.
It appeared that the suspect had shot her in the face in her front yard, then took her keys and her vehicle, which was a white Chrysler Concorde, and fled the area. She had been shot with a .38 revolver, the same type of handgun that was used in the homicides of Alicia Greer and Jacqueline Moore. Also, based upon witnesses, the suspect's physical description met that of Billy Boyette. During the investigation, officers had discovered some video footage. It showed the victim's vehicle being closely followed by a black SUV, a identical match for the vehicle that Billy was associated with. It was a good possibility that Billy Boyette is our suspect.
I knew Miss Peggy Brose from First Baptist Church of Lillian. Her and her husband were married 31 years. 2 adult children, grandkids. Whether it was with the Girl Scouts or at the hospital dealing with patients, her hobby really was to serve people. There was no need for this. She would have handed her keys over to avoid a confrontation.
In the area, there was a grocery store, and so we were able to go in there and collect video footage of the entire parking lot. You could see that it was early morning hours, not long after Peggy Brawes' death.
The stolen white Chrysler Concorde pulled in the parking lot of the grocery store.
Then the black SUV that Billy Boyett was known to be in pulls up directly beside it. And in the video, you see a white male exit the white car. We see that it's Billy Boyett. And then we see a female exit the black SUV. We make the connection that it's Mary Rice. It did not appear that she was being held against her will by any means. She appeared to be going on her everyday affairs as if they didn't have a care in the world. They didn't really care who saw them. They popped the rear trunk lid and began to load items out of the black SUV into the white car. He shuts the rear door and gets into the driver's side. They exit the parking lot, traveling east into Pensacola, leaving behind the black SUV.
We thought maybe he's holding her hostage, he's kidnapped her, but the video was showing Mary Rice and Billy Boyett working in concert together. Mary Rice appeared to be a willing accomplice. So we knew that now we're looking for two people. Through their investigation and talking to witnesses, we found evidence they did have a relationship.
Mary Rice's brother was incarcerated with Billy Boyett. Witnesses told us that he introduced her to Billy Boyett, and they wrote letters back and forth numerous times. Then Billy got out of prison, and they were kind of known to be together somewhat.
We obtained a search warrant and managed to get numerous phone messages between Mary Rice and Billy Boyett on the day those murders occurred.
Reading her text and reading his text back and forth, we were able to put two and two together that Mary Rice knew of the problems that he was having with Alicia Greer.
Investigators made the determination that she's a willing participant, not a victim.
A female by the name of Kayla Crocker was located by her mother, bound in rope.
Kayla was supposed to drop her child off with her mother for childcare. When she didn't show up, her mother became concerned and went to check on her, and that's when she discovered her own daughter.
I first observed upon entering the residence Kayla Crocker's child inside of the crib, crying erratically. So my sergeant immediately took the child out of the situation.
She had been shot in front of her own 2-year-old child.
Kayla was shot in the head with a pistol, and there was actually blood splatter and blood spray on the crib from her being shot. Kayla Crocker had been killed and her car taken.
It became an immediate concern that this was yet another victim of Billy Boyett due to the proximity of the area where her house was and the car being stolen. They seemed to have no qualms at all about killing somebody and taking their vehicle.
Kayla Crocker was 28 years old, and she was my little sister. As an adult, she was still very silly, still very vibrant, wanting to soak up everything that life had to offer. She really, really loved and adored her children. I couldn't have been more proud to be her big sister.
What we are experiencing is a running nightmare, quite honest. And in short, we have a killer, and he is in our midst.
Mr. Boyett, he's made this statement to many, many people that he will not be taken alive. So we ask, please, for your assistance.
You've got the 4 homicides now that have occurred within a close proximity.
We didn't know where they were, and that's pretty scary. We had to get this stopped.
Mary Rice had used her ID to check into that hotel. Georgia State Police surrounded the entire motel. Their SWAT team arrived. There was nowhere for them to go. We pretty much figured it was going to be a shootout.
They eventually make contact with Mary Rice, telling her that she needs to surrender, come out with her hands up, which she does. Georgia State Police SWAT makes entry. As soon as they make entry, Billy Boyett commits suicide with a gunshot wound to the head.
The manhunt for a triple murder suspect and his alleged accomplice is over.
It was about a 3.5-hour standoff. Mary Rice now in the custody of the Troup County Sheriff's Office. She was checked out by EMS, no apparent injuries.
Before we started our interview, Mary Rice was making allegations. She was being held against her will by Billy Boyett and that she had been sexually assaulted. Ultimately, that she was in fact a victim, not a willing participant.
All right, we all have cases from Santa Rosa, Escambia County, and Baldwin County, Alabama. And we'd like to hear your side of the story. There's always two sides to the story, okay? Are you willing to talk to us?
As soon as we start asking questions, she starts to get very emotional.
He's a monster. He's serious about everything he says. He was gonna kill me if I didn't do what he said. Only by God's grace am I sitting here today.
Billy Boyett is dead. Mary Rice is in custody.
Everyone is so grateful that they finally caught him. It's been a horrible week.
We had just let her start talking because we knew her state of mind was fragile. And of course, if you go in there too aggressive and then they shut down, then you've lost the whole interview.
Take a deep breath, Mary. You're okay right now. Just take a deep breath.
How do you know Mr. Boyett?
Okay, he was a friend of mine. We rode a little bit as pen pals. He seems like a good guy. Well, when Billy got out, he kept trying to contact me and stuff. He found out where I stayed. I mean, I didn't know what to do. I'm there in my house by myself, you know. So I let him in.
Do you recall what day that was?
It was just a couple of days prior to all this. He had some clothes or whatever, and he asked if I could wash them. I said, sure, you know, no problem. Then he left, and I don't know, I'd been asleep for a while. I'm not real sure what time it was, but it was still nighttime. And he came in, and he had blood on the side of his head, and he was like freaking out, pacing the floors, and he had a gun. You know, I just woke up, got this gun in my face. And the next thing I know, we're getting into a vehicle, and it was kind of a bigger vehicle, dark colored.
Like this is a sedan or a van or an SUV?
Like SUV like type thing.
Okay.
Kept saying it was an accident, it was an accident, it was an accident, and then he'd go quiet.
To your knowledge, did the incident at the Emerald Sands Inn, did that happen before he picked you up?
Yes. Yes. To my knowledge. That's probably where the blood came from his head. It is, you know, but I'm not asking too many questions.
And what did that make you think?
Serious, 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 serious.
All right, where did you go from there?
There we went riding, and he made me go into a Walmart.
Did he stay out in the car?
No, Yeah, he was in Walmart. Okay. He was watching me, and I know he could see me in the store.
What did you get at Walmart?
Ammunition, 38.
She doesn't know. We have the video from Walmart, and we did see that Billy's sitting in the car outside on camera. So we can see he stays there in the vehicle the entire time. And she's in Walmart on camera shopping like there's nothing going on. We tracked her all throughout the store with the interior cameras. She claims that he told her if she made any notifications to anybody or told anybody that he would kill her and kill her children as well. But she's in there by herself. Never did she make any type of notification, ask for help or assistance or anything. She was lying to us.
What happens then?
So I gotta get another ride, and I know where we're gonna get another ride. I feel like he's hunting humans. He left me probably maybe long enough for 2 cigarettes or something. I don't know. He comes back with white car.
So he goes off with a dark SUV and comes back with a white car?
Yes. He has somebody with him. They have a gun on me. They're in the back. And I didn't even get a good glimpse of who they were or anything. And I had to get in the car and drive. They kind of go to my side. I have to follow him to a parking area.
When you got into the car to drive, you got a person holding a gun to you, correct?
Yes.
Where did this other guy you're talking about, where did he come from?
I don't know, and I've never seen him after.
She has no idea that we have video surveillance of Mary Rice behind the wheel of the vehicle alone in the SUV, following Billy in the white car. We know that she's not telling the truth.
Is there anything else that you want to change or alter from what you've told us?
And Mary, you need to understand before you answer completely.
I'm thinking.
What's happened is in the past, but we need to clarify what this past is.
When we caught the black one, the other person stayed with it.
You can get a statement and people can lie, but the evidence does not lie.
Okay, that's not true. And I'll tell you why.
No, we did.
Mary, listen to me.
Okay.
If I were to tell you that numerous people saw you and Billy following the person in the white car to her home, where the white car was taken, you were with Billy, because you guys were seen together, okay? There wasn't a third person there then. It was just you and Billy, right?
Right.
Okay. Why did you tell me that?
Because I'm scared.
Well, I understand you're scared. The truth makes more sense than the story at this point, you know what I mean?
That's the truth.
Okay. Well, thank
And
you.
that's the only thing that I embellished on.
Okay, thank you for being honest.
I'm scared.
I know you are.
Whenever we would challenge her on these statements, she would eventually come with a little bit of the truth.
So, Mary, just look at me and let's be honest with each other right now.
He drives down this little spots, like he'd already scoped this thing out or something.
Okay. So
I didn't see anything.
Okay.
I mean, I know somebody got hurt.
Okay. What do you remember about that?
Gunshot.
You heard a gunshot.
Yeah.
Okay. And what happened after that?
Told him to follow him and gassed it.
Which car were you driving?
I had to drive the black one. He was in a white one.
And you followed him, and that's when you pulled into a parking lot, you said?
At first, he had me grab some stuff and throw it in there. That's when he hit me, and then he goes, no, never mind. And he grabs me and puts me in the white car. It was like he'd have an ice belly, and then you'd have like Jekyll and Hyde, for real.
Just understand, these questions we're asking, we pretty much have the answers to them, and we have evidence to back up a lot of the answers we already know about. We just want you to be honest. There's surveillance of both you guys, Billy getting out of the white car and unloading stuff out of the black car. You getting out of the black car and helping to move stuff from the black car to the white car as well, and then you both get in the white car and leave.
She's sitting down with her shoulders forward, her head's dropped down, contemplating, do I tell the truth? I want you to concentrate on that time that you guys got the last car.
There's a place that sits long ways. This girl, she started the car and went inside. Makes me go around the trailer, throws me in the car, takes the keys, follows her inside.
Did you see her go into the house?
I didn't.
Okay.
I didn't, but I heard a woman.
What did you hear?
I heard I have to go to work.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom. I have to go to work with my mom. I was not in there. I swear to God, I wasn't in there. I wasn't. Look, I'm telling you, I didn't witness anything.
She minimized her involvement, saying that she's trapped in the back seat, but had she actually been in the back seat of the car, she would not have heard Kayla Crocker. I actually picked my chair up and moved it over in front of her and sat down and leaned forward and get closer to her, close that gap to her. As she realizes that now she's got to focus to me, I was going to have to be direct with her and call her out on her mistakes and her untruthfulness. I'm not here to judge you by any means, okay? We just want the truth from you. That's all we're looking to get from you, okay? Did you actually go inside the house?
At one point, I actually went inside the house.
Okay. And I'm glad that you said that. But sometimes we make mistakes, and we have to own up to those mistakes. I want you to tell me some more about inside that house.
She was fighting him. She was mouthy with him. He says, pick up that rope and give it to me.
So you bent down and picked it up and you handed it to Billy?
Yes.
Okay. And then what happened after that?
He said that he was just gonna tie her up.
So you didn't help tie her up at all?
He tied her up, and I just did the bow. In the back, I tied a little bow, to where she could get out.
I knew how Kayla was bound. That's not a factual statement. Now, when Billy tied her up, or when you guys tied her up, because you helped tie her up, you said you tied the bow in the back, even though she could get it out if she wanted to.
Yes.
Okay. Was the guns loaded at that particular time?
Yes, he always kept them loaded.
He did.
I wasn't in the house though after that. And he made me leave. I went outside and I threw the stuff in the car, and before I could turn around, I hear gunshots. He comes out and he said she shouldn't have backtalked me. She was gonna call him out. I couldn't trust her.
She knew she was caught, had said enough, and then emotions come flooding in.
It was a collective agreement between all of us that she was at the point that she was about to shut down. We just chose at that time to abruptly end the interview. I mean, it's cut and dry and clear as it could be. We had enough that we had a signed arrest warrant by a judge to charge her with murder.
Thank you for your cooperation.
she will still be tried in Baldwin County for the murder of Peggy Brose. The big question is, when?
It could be decades before Mary Rice ever sees an Alabama courtroom. Now, according to the information that the DA's office got from Florida, Mary Rice would have to serve 80% of her life sentence, or 30 years, before she could be extradited back to Alabama.
As a homicide investigator, I mean, you are speaking for the victims. They can no longer speak for themselves.
Mary Rice did a very good job of making herself appear to be a victim. And the average person, I think, would feel very sorry for her so she could get out of it. The interview was valuable because it showed some inconsistencies in her story. She gave us insight into what her role in all of this was.
Mary Rice is as guilty as Billy Boyette. She had a choice, and she chose to follow Billy Boyette. And she is paying the price for her actions. We will never understand why things happen the way they did. The thing we have to understand is there's evil in this world.
We were so grateful that law enforcement ensured that justice would be served quickly. And I am relieved to know that she will never walk free. But nothing can ever make up for the loss of their mother. They don't deserve to live life without her.
I remember it being brutally cold. I got there pretty quick. A black pickup was lodged against a tree. We've all got our high-powered flashlights, and we're all on our hands and knees trying to find evidence. At the bottom of the ditch, very hastily covered with some leaves and a stick, there was a body of a young male. There were multiple gunshot wounds.
He was a good kid. He was so fun-loving. He loved life. He loved his friends. He loved his family. He seen the good in everybody, My son had a lot of friends. They all loved him, and he gave the best hugs. He did. I wonder all the time if he knew how proud I was of him. I miss him like crazy.
I met Gennaro in the 5th grade, and we were friends all the way up through college from that point on. He just kind of almost had a gravity to him that people wanted to be around him because he was always upbeat and happy, and he was always positive. He thought everyone, whether they really were or not, was probably a good person. Everybody was his friend. So I don't think it really sunk in until I knew who was responsible, and then it just seemed obvious.
I received a phone call from the dispatch that a body had been found next to a pickup in a ditch on a road that is known as Substation Road. On the way, I was hearing radio traffic of a possible suspect could be walking down the road north of that. So I kind of decided to check it out on the way, and I came across an individual walking northbound on the highway. He was wearing a suit with a white shirt with a tie, had a trench coat on, and I found that odd at that time of the morning. I made a quick U-turn in behind him. He spun around. Not knowing whether he had a weapon or not, I drew my weapon and ordered him on the ground. I said, I'm going to ask you one time, do you have a weapon on you? And he said, no, but I am the guy you're trying to find. I'm the guy that killed the guy on Substation Road. His name was Jared Murray. He was not aggressive at all, but you see very few kids in a three-piece suit with a tie and a trench coat walking around at 2:30 in the morning. And that was kind of spooky. I actually read his Miranda warning to him on the side of the road and then cuffed him and put him in my unit. Just because you confess, we just don't, okay, it's done, we're over with, everybody go home. And you got to have evidence to back that confession. That's our job, number one. I just didn't know that it was going to be as dark as it was on his point of view on the murder.
My name is Under Sheriff J.T. Palmer. Me and you met on the side of Highway 177 in Matsine Road at about 3:12 this morning, didn't we?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and what do you remember telling me?
In summation that I'm guilty, yes.
Of what?
Of murder.
Okay, and who did you murder?
Gennaro. I do not know how to spell that, but it is with a G.
Okay, and how did you murder him?
With a gun. I shot him in the head twice.
And do you go to school with him?
Yes, sir.
Was that his pickup or your pickup?
I'm fairly sure it was his, sir.
Okay, and do you remember what kind of pickup that was?
Black.
Okay, now, how did you guys hook up?
I went down to his dorm room and asked if I could be given a ride to Walmart in exchange for $20 gas money. We pulled into the parking lot, then I pulled the weapon on him and demanded that he take me to Asher, Oklahoma, sir.
Okay, and why did all of a sudden did you decide that you needed to go to Asher?
Because I was planning to take him out into the country and kill him.
We're sitting in an enclosed room that's not very big with a table between us. And I'm looking him right in the eye. And to me, it was pure evil is what I was seeing in his eyes. But it kind of takes you by shock that you're thinking, all right, wait a minute. Did he actually do this, or is he covering for somebody else and that person's going on down the road? And so it was kind of concerning.
So you're headed east on the road with a pickup?
Yes, sir.
Is at now. Didn't he's driving?
Yes, sir.
And did you have any conversation between Ada and Asher?
The entire time was a conversation. He panicked, went to pull out his phone. I yanked the phone out of his hand, and then he panicked some more. Kept telling me not to kill him. I told him that I wasn't going to kill him to calm his nerves. And then from that point on, we was talking on our upbringings, our past, our family histories, things of more philosophical nature, etc., etc.
And so I guess at some point, did you decide now was the time?
Yes, sir. Shot once, missed. Shot a second time, hit, jumped out of the car, went around. He was driving 10, 15 miles an hour, so it was not until he already had hit the tree. I heard him gurgling. I'm not sure if that was a physiological or physical process after death, but I thought that he might have still lived through that somehow, because he was gurgling, so I shot him again and then shoved him down in the ditch. And then I tried to cover it, admittedly not well, with leaves, dirts, and stick.
And so, after you got the body covered up, what did you do then?
I headed back to the truck and tried to get it unstuck.
And so you could get the truck out, so what did you do then?
Then I walked away. I headed north.
And in my mind, I'm thinking, wow. I never had interviewed anybody that had been that cold and callous.
Do you feel any remorse?
I'm sad that I got caught so quickly. But that's almost lessened by being caught by someone who has sheriff on their jacket, so...
So it makes you feel better that you got caught by somebody up in rank than somebody under...
Yes, sir.
I was receiving text messages from the sheriff. He kept telling me there was no gun in the truck. They couldn't find the gun. I'm thinking, okay, somebody else was with me and they've got the gun. So I was making sure that we didn't have another suspect out there.
I'm still got the gun.
Yes, sir.
I need to know where that gun's at.
It was in the truck, sir.
The gun's not in the truck.
When I left the scene, it was in the truck, sir.
Usually I'm the one, no, you're not telling me the truth. And he said, no, I'm telling you the truth.
You told me you got the gun in the pickup.
Yes, sir. It was still in the truck, sir.
Where was it at in the truck?
I believe it was on the center console, but it's possible it could have been between the driver's seat and the center console.
He was so adamant the gun was in the seat, and we had to have it.
We looked again, and we did find a note on the passenger side door, I think, kind of stuck in there that said, come to the house at the end of the street.
They go about 2 houses down and find the guy that found the pickup. He didn't know what had happened. He just saw the gun, so he took the gun out of the seat and left a note that he had it. The sheriff called me back and said, hey, we've got the gun. That was a kind of a relief moment that, okay, we found the gun, that I kind of thought then, okay, there's nobody else out there.
You killed a young man.
Yes, sir.
Why did you do it?
If I'm pressed to answer, I'll say it's to prove the strength of my resolve. But that's only if I'm pressed to answer.
I'm not pressing you, I'm just trying to understand.
Then I don't know why.
Okay. So it just
popped in my head.
And why him? All the kids in college here, why you?
I believed that he would have had the least impact, sir.
Impact of what?
I believed he didn't have many friends, or many close friends, I should rephrase. His absence would be less notable.
You don't think your girlfriend would miss him? You don't think she's going to be upset, heartbroken?
I think she will be, sir.
How does that make you feel?
No different, sir.
Or are you going to kill anybody else?
No, sir.
Tell me why I should believe you that there just was going to be one person that was going to suffer from your consequences of killing.
You have no reason to believe me, sir.
Do you feel any remorse?
No.
What do you think should happen to you?
Death sentence, sir.
And why do you think you deserve a death sentence?
An eye for an eye, sir.
All right. We'll be getting you taken out to the jail here shortly, okay?
Yes, sir.
I've done a lot of interviews, and I've had them where they're crying and they're upset, they get mad. He didn't. He looked you right in the eye on every question. Probably the only interview that I ever did that the hair kind of stood up on the back of my neck. This is pure evil talking to me.
Jared Murray's defense counsel had him evaluated. They very quickly found him to meet the legal findings of not guilty by reason of insanity. Antisocial personality disorder. The characteristics are a flat affect, a lack of empathy, lack of impulse control, and a bunch of other things that fit Gerard Murray to a T. Gerard Murray was going to a secure facility where the high risk, the very dangerous people that are found not guilty by reason of insanity are sent. But 15 years from now, he's going to learn how to play the system. He's a highly intelligent and highly dangerous man. Is there a chance he can be released? Absolutely, he can.
I was angry. I was livid. He's not in the place where he should be. He should be in prison. He's had the taste for blood. He got away with it once. And so he would try to do it again. I think that if he ever got out, everybody around him would be in danger because you just don't know what would set him off. the law changed. This protects everybody. My son's life had meaning, and his death will have meaning.
I was told after this case I was the confession master. But even though I got a confession, I will never be convinced that justice was served in this case.
I want people to know that everything Gennaro did up to the moment he died, he was trying to make other people's lives better, and he did a good job of that. Just because it didn't end well with him doesn't mean that we shouldn't all try to be a little bit more like Gennaro Sanchez.
Los Angeles does not sleep the way people imagine. It breathes in fragments. Neon flickers through smog, freeway lights stretch into endless ribbons of red and white, and somewhere between midnight and dawn, the city forgets who it is supposed to protect. On certain streets in South Central, that forgetting has a weight to it. A silence that feels deliberate, as if even the wind has learned where not to go. On one of those nights, long before the world would ever hear the name, Grim Sleeper, a woman walked alone under a broken streetlight. The bulb above her head blinked weakly, struggling against the dark like it was tired of trying. Somewhere nearby, a car engine idled longer than it should have. Not rushing. Not hesitating. Just waiting. No one recorded the exact sound she made when she realized she was no longer alone. No one wrote down the exact moment fear replaced instinct. But what remains, what history refused to erase, is the pattern. Because she was not the first. And she would not be the last. Years later, investigators would look back at these streets and see not randomness, but rhythm. A hidden cadence of violence stretching across decades, as if someone had been pressing pause and play on human life itself. The same type of victims appeared again and again. The same neighborhoods. The same quiet disappearance from a world that barely noticed they were gone. At first, the city did not connect the dots. Los Angeles was too large, too fractured, too distracted by its own chaos. A missing person in South Los Angeles did not echo into Beverly Hills. A body found in an alley did not interrupt traffic on the 405. Each case was a single drop in an ocean that refused to freeze. But oceans remember. In the mid-1980s, police files began to collect something unusual. Not just murders, but similarities. Women, mostly young. Many of them living on the margins of society, surviving in spaces where visibility was already a luxury they could not afford. Some struggled with addiction. Some were sex workers. Some were simply trying to get home and never made it. The reports were brief, almost clinical. Found in an alley. Found behind a dumpster. Found in a vacant lot. Cause of death, strangulation. In some cases, a gunshot. In others, evidence of both restraint and execution, as if the act of killing had been rehearsed more than once before the final performance. And yet, even with all these fragments, there was no face to attach to the violence. No name that kept appearing in witness statements. No suspect that held long enough under scrutiny to become real. It was as if the city was being visited by something that knew how to remain unseen. Then, in 1988, something changed. Not because the violence stopped in a way that brought relief, but because it stopped in a way that brought confusion. The cases simply slowed. Then vanished. Officers reassigned their attention. Files were archived. Some believed the killer had been caught in another case. Others believed he had died or moved away. There were even quiet theories that more than one offender had been responsible, and that what they were seeing had never been a single thread at all. And so Los Angeles did what it always does when confronted with unresolved fear. It moved forward. It forgot just enough to function. For 14 years, the silence held. 14 years is long enough for a child to become an adult. Long enough for entire neighborhoods to change identity. Long enough for investigators to retire, for evidence rooms to overflow, for memories to blur into rumor. But silence, when it is unnatural, does not mean absence. In 2002, the pattern returned. It did not announce itself. There were no headlines declaring a resurgence. Only a familiar kind of report, landing again in police databases with unsettling repetition. A woman found dead in South Los Angeles. Similar circumstances. Similar victim profile. Similar cause of death. Then another. And another. At first, the connection was not obvious. After all, years had passed. Technology had improved. Policing methods had changed. But when analysts began comparing old cases with new ones, something uncomfortable emerged. The signatures matched. Not just in method, but in rhythm. As if someone had paused a long-running act and resumed it without missing a beat. This was no longer a series of isolated tragedies. This was continuity. Investigators gave the unknown offender a name, as they always do when identity is absent, but pattern is undeniable. They called him the Grim Sleeper. The name itself carried contradiction. Sleep suggests rest. Absence. Stillness. But this sleep was not peaceful. It was waiting. It implied consciousness beneath the surface, awareness preserved through years of silence. It suggested that whoever was responsible had been present all along, even when no one was looking. Detectives began to revisit old case files with new urgency. Cold evidence was re-examined. Autopsy notes were compared. Geographic clustering was mapped across city grids. Slowly, a shape began to emerge from the chaos. A predator who selected vulnerability with precision. A hunter who operated in spaces where victims would not be immediately missed. A presence that understood the geography of invisibility in Los Angeles better than the people tasked with policing it. Still, understanding a pattern is not the same as finding a person. And for a long time, there was nothing else to hold on to. Witnesses were unreliable or non-existent. Physical evidence degraded. Surveillance in the 1980s had been minimal, especially in neighborhoods that rarely received investment. Even the DNA samples collected at early crime scenes were, for years, useless without a match in any database. The case became a quiet obsession among a small group of investigators. The kind of case that does not leave office walls or sleep schedules. The kind that lingers in the back of the mind during unrelated conversations, during dinners with family, during moments when the brain should be resting but refuses to let go. Because somewhere out there, someone had been walking freely for decades. Living. Working. Blending. Possibly laughing. Possibly unaware that his shadow had already been documented more carefully than his face. In South Los Angeles, life continued in its usual tension. Sirens in the distance. Street lights flickering. People learning to recognize danger not by appearance, but by instinct. The absence of safety becomes its own language in places like this. A glance held too long. A car circling twice. A silence that feels heavier than it should. And beneath it all, unnoticed by everyone, the question that would eventually define the entire investigation remained unanswered. Who had been walking these streets at night for over 2 decades, and why had no one ever seen him clearly? The answer, when it finally came, would not arrive through confession or chance. It would come through something far less dramatic. Something ordinary. A trace. A fragment. A discarded piece of life so small that no one could have imagined it would carry the weight of dozens of deaths. But before that moment, before the name Lonnie Franklin Jr. would ever enter public consciousness, there was only darkness. And in that darkness, a pattern that refused to disappear. South Los Angeles is not a place that reveals itself quickly. It exists in layers, like paint applied over and over again on a wall that never fully forgets what was underneath. To understand the crimes that would later define the Grim Sleeper case, one has to understand the streets themselves, because in this part of the city, geography is never just geography. It is history, neglect, survival, and silence all folded into one. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, South Central Los Angeles carried the weight of abandonment in ways that were visible even before a single word was spoken. Buildings stood with cracked windows and faded facades, as if they had been slowly losing their memory. Vacant lots replaced homes that had burned, been demolished, or simply left behind. On some blocks, entire stretches of sidewalk were interrupted by weeds pushing through concrete, nature reclaiming space that society had stopped maintaining. The people who lived there did not describe it in abstract terms. They described it in practical ones. You learn which corners to avoid after dark. You memorize which streetlights stay broken longer than others. You understand that police presence is inconsistent, sometimes responsive, often distant. Safety becomes something negotiated daily, not something assumed. It was in this environment that Lonnie Franklin Jr. lived his life. To neighbors, he was not a shadow or a mystery. He was visible, present, even ordinary. He worked as a sanitation worker for the city of Los Angeles, a job that placed him in the rhythm of the city's daily cleanup, moving through neighborhoods while most people were either asleep or just beginning their routines. He was the kind of person seen in passing, acknowledged with a nod, then forgotten within minutes. He had a family. He had routines. He had the kind of existence that did not invite suspicion, because it did not demand attention. There was nothing theatrical about him, nothing that suggested he might be capable of the kind of violence later attributed to him. And that, in many ways, is what made the eventual revelations so unsettling. Because in South Los Angeles, survival often depends on reading danger quickly. But Franklin did not present himself as danger. He blended into the same environment that would later be described as his hunting ground. During the years when the first wave of murders was occurring, the city itself was undergoing pressure from multiple directions. Economic instability, rising unemployment, and strained public services created a sense of chronic instability in certain neighborhoods. Law enforcement resources were stretched, and investigations into crimes involving marginalized victims often lacked urgency from the broader system. The women who became victims in these cases were not invisible in the literal sense, but they were frequently rendered invisible in practice. Many lived lives that intersected with risk on a daily basis. Some were struggling with addiction, others engaged in survival sex work, others simply existed in spaces where social support systems had failed to reach them consistently. Their absences did not always trigger immediate alarms. Sometimes hours passed. Sometimes days. Sometimes longer. And in that delay, danger found opportunity. The streets themselves contributed to this vulnerability. Nighttime in South Central had its own character. It was not entirely silent, nor entirely active. It was a suspended state, where distant sirens echoed across blocks, where passing cars slowed at intersections for reasons that were not always innocent, where pedestrians moved with an awareness of unseen presence. It was in this environment that patterns of predation could remain unnoticed for longer than they should have. A person walking alone at the wrong hour did not necessarily stand out. A car circling a block might be ignored as routine. A conversation that turned uncomfortable could be dismissed as misunderstanding. The system was saturated with too much ordinary risk to immediately recognize extraordinary threat. When investigators later reconstructed the early timeline of the Grim Sleeper cases, they found themselves repeatedly returning to the same conclusion: the environment itself had provided cover. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but structurally. The conditions of the neighborhood made it possible for violence to blend into noise. But even within that environment, something about the pattern stood out in hindsight. The victims were not randomly distributed across the city. They were concentrated in specific areas. Certain intersections, certain stretches of road, certain vacant spaces appeared in reports again and again. The geography of the crimes formed a kind of invisible map, one that only became visible when overlaid across years of data. Still, at the time, no one saw the full picture. Franklin's personal life, viewed from the outside, offered no obvious cracks. He attended work. He interacted with co-workers. He maintained relationships that appeared stable enough to avoid scrutiny. To those around him, he was not a figure of mystery but of routine. This is often how serial offenders survive in urban environments. Not through brilliance or invisibility, but through familiarity. They are seen too often to be questioned. They exist within social roles that grant them automatic assumptions of normality. A worker, a neighbor, a family member. These identities act as shields, not because they conceal behavior, but because they discourage deeper inquiry. Meanwhile, the city continued to generate cases that would later be connected to the same unknown offender. Each new discovery added weight to an already growing sense of unease within certain police divisions. Detectives assigned to the cases began to recognize a frustrating pattern. Every time they believed they might be closing in on a suspect, the trail would collapse. Witnesses could not provide consistent descriptions. Surveillance technology was limited or non-existent in key locations. Physical evidence, when collected, often degraded or led nowhere without comparative data. Even when forensic material was preserved, it sat for years without yielding answers, because there was nothing to match it against. And so the investigation lived in a kind of suspended motion. Active enough to prevent closure, but stalled enough to prevent resolution. Within the communities most affected, however, there was no suspension. There was only continuation. People adapted to the presence of uncertainty in different ways. Some became more cautious in their movements. Others relied on informal networks of communication, warning each other about suspicious activity or unsafe areas. Many simply lived with a background awareness that danger was not abstract, but local. Parents instructed children differently depending on time of day. Friends checked in on each other more frequently when someone did not arrive home on schedule. The absence of institutional clarity forced the creation of informal systems of care. But fear, when it becomes normalized, also becomes quiet. By the time the second wave of killings began in the early 2000s, many of the original investigators from the 1980s cases had moved on. Some retired. Some were reassigned. Some simply carried the unresolved memory of the case into other parts of their careers. New detectives entered the investigation with fresh eyes, but also with the burden of inherited confusion. The city had changed in some ways by then. Technology had improved. DNA analysis had become more sophisticated. Databases were larger. But the fundamental challenge remained the same. There was still no name. Still no confirmed suspect. Still no clear break in the pattern. The Grim Sleeper, as he would soon be called, had resumed activity in a city that had learned to live without expecting resolution. And so South Los Angeles remained what it had always been in this story, not just a backdrop, but an active participant in the unfolding of events. Its streets carried memory even when official records did not. Its silence held echoes of things that had not yet been understood. And beneath the surface of everyday life, the conditions that allowed violence to disappear into routine continued to exist, unchanged by time. In that space between visibility and neglect, between recognition and assumption, the story of Lonnie Franklin Jr. would continue to unfold. Not yet exposed. Not yet interrupted. Still hidden in plain sight, waiting for the smallest fracture in routine to finally bring it into the light, before the investigation had a name, before the press would ever use the phrase, grim sleeper. There were lives that unfolded quietly in the margins of Los Angeles, each one carrying its own history, its own struggles, and its own version of hope that the city never fully witnessed. The victims in this case were not statistics at the moment they were alive. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. They existed in full emotional complexity, even if the world only recorded their deaths in fragments. One of the most important truths that detectives later had to confront was that understanding the killer alone would never be enough. To understand the pattern, they had to understand the people he chose. Not as symbols, not as categories, but as individuals whose lives had been shaped long before they ever crossed his path. Many of the women later linked to the Grim Sleeper case lived in South Los Angeles during a period when economic instability and social fragmentation were deeply rooted in the structure of daily life. Some had grown up in the same neighborhoods where they would later be found. Others had moved there seeking affordability or proximity to family. A few were simply passing through a city that rarely paused to protect those without stable resources. Their lives often intersected with systems that were already strained. Housing insecurity, limited access to healthcare, and cycles of poverty created conditions where survival required constant negotiation. For some, substance abuse became part of that landscape. For others, involvement in informal economies, including sex work, was not a defining identity, but a means of navigating immediate necessity. It is important to understand that none of these circumstances diminished their humanity. Yet in the structure of police response during the 1980s and 1990s, these factors often influenced how quickly a case was prioritized, how thoroughly it was investigated, and how urgently it was pursued. This imbalance would later become one of the most painful aspects of the case for investigators, who revisited it with hindsight. One of the recurring profiles among the victims was young women in their late teens to early 30s, many of whom were navigating unstable environments with limited support systems. Some were known to friends and family as resilient, even optimistic despite their circumstances. Others were described as quiet, guarded, or transient in their social connections, moving between locations as opportunities or necessity dictated. To the outside observer, their lives might have appeared fragmented. But within those fragments existed continuity. Relationships that mattered. Daily routines that provided structure. Small ambitions that persisted even in difficult conditions. A conversation with a sibling. A phone call that never got returned. A plan to meet someone later that never came to pass. Each victim represented a point in a wider human network that extended beyond the moment of their death. And when those connections were severed, the impact was not immediately visible in official records, but deeply felt in private spaces. Families often described the experience of uncertainty as the most painful stage. Not knowing whether their loved one was safe or missing or simply delayed created a psychological state that could stretch for hours or days before clarity arrived. In many cases, the delay between disappearance and discovery was long enough to complicate investigative efforts. Time, in these situations, became an adversary. When bodies were eventually found, the circumstances were often consistent with a disturbing pattern. Many were discovered in outdoor locations that were partially concealed from immediate view. Vacant lots, alleyways, or areas near industrial or abandoned structures became repeated points of recovery. The positioning of the bodies, combined with forensic findings, suggested a level of physical control that indicated deliberate restraint before death. The cause of death in most confirmed cases was strangulation, though some also involved gunshot wounds. The combination of methods suggested variability in approach, or perhaps adaptation over time. This variability initially complicated efforts to link cases together, especially in the early years when forensic technology was limited. But beyond the forensic details, there was another layer that investigators struggled with: the human response. In many of the early reports, witnesses or acquaintances described victims as individuals who were trying to maintain stability in environments that made stability difficult. Some were working toward leaving difficult situations behind. Others were attempting to reconnect with family or rebuild fractured relationships. These intentions, often unfinished, added a haunting dimension to the case. Because what the investigation revealed over time was not only a series of deaths, but a series of interrupted trajectories. Lives that were still in motion when they were suddenly stopped. One of the challenges faced by law enforcement was that many of the victims existed in overlapping social circles, or shared similar environments, but not always in ways that were immediately visible to investigators. Without modern data aggregation tools, patterns remained hidden in separate case files, each labeled individually rather than collectively analyzed. It was only years later, when analysts began comparing records across time, that the scale of overlap became apparent. Names that had once appeared in isolated reports began to form clusters when viewed through a broader lens. Locations repeated. Methods aligned. Victim profiles showed consistent patterns of vulnerability rather than coincidence. Yet even with this emerging structure, the victims remained more than data points. In interviews with family members conducted years after the crimes, a different picture emerged. A young woman remembered for her sense of humor, even during hardship. A mother who consistently prioritized her children despite instability in her own life. A sister who maintained regular contact even when circumstances made communication difficult. These memories resisted reduction. They existed outside of forensic analysis, outside of investigative categorization. They reminded those working the case that each file represented a life that had been experienced in real time, with real emotional depth. For detectives revisiting the case years later, this became an emotional burden. Cold case work often requires emotional distance, but in this instance, distance was difficult to maintain. The repetition of similar circumstances created a sense of haunting familiarity. Each new file felt connected not only through evidence, but through absence. Absence of witnesses. Absence of closure. Absence of accountability for years that stretched between crimes. The most difficult aspect for many involved in the investigation was the realization that some of the victims had likely encountered their killer in ordinary contexts before the final moments of their lives. He was not a myth or distant figure. He was part of the same streets, the same routines, the same environment that shaped their daily decisions. This proximity redefined the way investigators understood the danger. It was not random violence from an unknown external force. It was embedded within the social and geographic fabric of the community itself. As the case evolved, the victims' identities became central to understanding the urgency of the investigation. Their stories were no longer secondary to the search for the perpetrator. They became the foundation of why the case mattered. Each life reconstructed through interviews, records, and memories became a reminder of what had been lost not only through violence, but through time. And yet, for many years, justice remained distant. Before any breakthrough could occur, before any arrest could be made, before the name Lonnie Franklin Jr. would be spoken in courtrooms and news reports, the victims remained suspended in a space between recognition and anonymity. Known to those who loved them, but not yet fully restored in public memory. It would take decades, technological advances, and a series of small, but critical investigative decisions before the pattern would finally converge on a single individual. But even then, the most important part of the case would never change. Because long before the world searched for the man responsible, there were women whose lives deserved to be remembered in full, not only in the context of how they were taken, but in the fullness of who they were while they were still alive. There is no single moment that defines the beginning of the Grim Sleeper case, because violence in this story did not arrive like a sudden explosion. It arrived like repetition. Like something rehearsed in silence long before anyone realized a pattern was forming. Each incident, when viewed alone, appeared incomplete in its meaning. But together, they formed a sequence that investigators would later describe as disturbingly consistent, as if the same invisible hand had been writing variations of the same ending for years. In the mid-1980s, South Los Angeles was already accustomed to loss. But even in a place where tragedy was not unusual, certain discoveries created a different kind of stillness. It was not the kind of silence that came from peace. It was the kind that came from recognition, even when recognition was delayed. The first cases that would later be associated with the Grim Sleeper investigation were not immediately linked. Each was handled as an individual homicide, each assigned its own file, its own detectives, its own timeline. At the time, there was no unified narrative, no sense that these events belonged to a shared pattern. There were only reports, crime scenes, and bodies discovered in locations that seemed to resist easy explanation. One of the earliest recurring details was location. Many victims were found in outdoor spaces that were not entirely hidden, but not actively observed either. Vacant lots bordered by chain-link fences. Narrow alleyways where trash accumulated in uneven layers. Side streets that intersected with larger roads, but rarely attracted foot traffic at night. These were places that existed in visibility without attention, spaces where something could occur without immediate interruption. The conditions of discovery often shared unsettling similarities. Some victims were partially clothed, others fully clothed but positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement. In several cases, there were signs of restraint prior to death, indicating control rather than impulsive violence. The primary cause of death, in many instances, was strangulation, a method that requires proximity, sustained physical contact, and an extended period of dominance over the victim. In a few cases, gunshot wounds were also present, either as primary or secondary cause of death. This variation initially complicated early investigative efforts. It suggested either multiple offenders, or an offender, who was capable of adapting methods depending on circumstance. At the time, neither possibility could be confirmed. Witness statements, when available, were fragmented. Some individuals reported seeing vehicles in the vicinity of where victims were last known to be alive, but descriptions were inconsistent. Cars were described in vague terms, color uncertain, make and model often unreliable due to darkness or distance. Other witnesses recalled brief interactions, conversations that seemed normal at the time, but acquired significance only after the fact. In many instances, however, there were no witnesses at all. The incidents occurred in temporal gaps where the city was least observant. Late night hours, early morning transitions, moments when activity was minimal and attention dispersed. This absence of observation became one of the defining challenges of the case. Investigators working these early incidents often described a sense of fragmentation in the evidence. Each scene offered partial information, but never enough to construct a complete picture. Forensic techniques at the time were also limited compared to later decades. DNA analysis was in its infancy, and while biological evidence was sometimes collected, it could not yet be used to its full investigative potential. As a result, early attempts to connect the cases relied heavily on behavioral analysis and geographic mapping. Detectives began to notice that certain neighborhoods appeared repeatedly in the reports. South Central Los Angeles, in particular, became a focal point of concern. Within that broader area, specific corridors of streets began to emerge as points of concentration. Still, without a confirmed suspect or a consistent eyewitness account, the cases remained formally separate. Each incident carried its own investigative trajectory, and over time, many of them stalled. Families of victims experienced this stagnation differently. For them, each incident was not an entry in a system, but a rupture in daily life. The moment of disappearance often began with confusion rather than immediate alarm. A missed phone call. An absence at a usual meeting place. A delay that extended longer than expected. Only gradually did concern transform into fear, and fear into the realization that something irreversible may have occurred. When bodies were eventually discovered, the confirmation brought closure in a technical sense, but not in an emotional one. The question of what had happened remained partially unanswered for years, even after identification. How the victim ended up in that location. Why that particular moment? Who had been responsible? These unanswered questions accumulated across cases, forming an invisible archive of uncertainty that would later define the investigation. One of the most disturbing aspects of the early incidents was the lack of clear escalation pattern. In many serial crime investigations, analysts look for increasing frequency or evolving brutality. In this case, however, there was a period of apparent cessation after the late 1980s. For over a decade, the pattern seemed to stop entirely. No new cases matching the earlier profile were identified. No clear continuation emerged. At the time, this was interpreted as resolution. Investigators considered several possibilities. The offender may have died. He may have been incarcerated for an unrelated crime. He may have moved out of the region entirely. Without new incidents, the working assumption shifted away from active threat. This interpretation would later prove incorrect, but during that period, it allowed the case files to fade into the background of ongoing police work. Then, in the early 2000s, the pattern reappeared. At first, it did not immediately trigger recognition. The gap in time was too large, and institutional memory had fragmented. New investigators were assigned to cases that resembled earlier ones, but without immediate awareness of historical continuity. It was only when forensic analysts began comparing data across decades that the connection became undeniable. The similarities were not superficial. They were structural. Victim profiles aligned. Methods of killing showed consistency. Geographic distribution overlapped with earlier clusters. Even the choice of disposal sites reflected continuity with prior incidents. It was at this point that investigators began to reconsider the earlier assumption of cessation. What had appeared to be an end was now understood as a pause. A pause that lasted years. This realization fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. It was no longer a series of unrelated homicides. It was a prolonged pattern of behavior separated by an unexplained temporal gap. The incidents themselves, when re-examined collectively, revealed something more unsettling than previously understood. They suggested a level of patience and control that extended beyond immediate impulse. The offender did not appear to be constrained by external pressure during the pause period. Instead, the absence of activity suggested intentional withdrawal. This behavior raised new questions for investigators. What had occurred during those years of silence? Was the offender inactive, or simply undetected? Had he changed his methods, or moved his focus elsewhere? Or had he remained entirely present, observing without acting? None of these questions could be answered through physical evidence alone. As the investigation expanded, attention returned to the original incident reports. Analysts reread witness statements, re-examined crime scene photographs, and reprocessed any remaining biological evidence that had been preserved. Advances in forensic science allowed for new interpretations of old samples, though results remained limited without a suspect for comparison. Still, each revisited case added incremental clarity. Not in the form of a breakthrough, but in the form of reinforcement. The realization that these incidents were not isolated failures of protection, but part of a sustained pattern of targeted violence. By the time investigators formally consolidated the cases under the Grim Sleeper designation, the incidents had already spanned decades. Each individual crime remained a distinct tragedy, but together they formed a narrative of persistence that challenged earlier assumptions about duration, visibility, and detection. And at the center of that narrative remained a fundamental absence. A person who had moved through these moments without being identified. A presence inferred through outcomes, but never directly observed in the act itself. The incidents told the story of what had happened. But they did not yet explain who had made it happen. That answer would require a different kind of evidence. One that did not come from the past alone, but from something far more unexpected in the present. The first time investigators began to feel that something about the Grim Sleeper case might finally shift. It did not come from a dramatic breakthrough, or a sudden confession. It came from something far quieter, almost fragile in its initial form. A fragment of biological evidence, collected years earlier, sitting in a system that had grown far more powerful than it had been when the evidence was first stored. In the early stages of the investigation, when the first bodies were discovered in South Los Angeles during the 1980s, forensic science was limited in ways that modern investigators sometimes struggle to imagine. DNA analysis existed, but it was not yet the dominant investigative tool it would later become. Evidence was collected with care, but the expectation that it would one day yield a precise identity was still uncertain. Many samples were preserved in storage, labeled carefully, but without a clear path toward resolution. For years, those samples remained dormant. They were physical remnants of unresolved violence, stored in evidence rooms that continued to expand as new cases arrived and old cases faded into administrative history. Boxes were stacked in climate-controlled rooms. Files were archived. And for a long time, there was no reason to believe that anything inside them would ever change the course of the investigation. But time does not only preserve. It also transforms. By the late 2000s, forensic technology had advanced to a point where even degraded biological material could yield meaningful results. DNA databases had been built and expanded across jurisdictions. What once required direct comparison to a known suspect could now be cross-referenced against vast collections of genetic profiles. It was in this environment that the first real shift occurred. Analysts revisiting the Grim Sleeper cases began by re-examining evidence from multiple crime scenes. The goal was not necessarily to solve the case immediately, but to ensure that nothing had been overlooked in earlier processing. This kind of review is slow, methodical work. It does not announce itself with certainty. Instead, it builds momentum through repetition and careful comparison. At one of the preserved evidence sets, a biological sample yielded a partial DNA profile. It was not complete enough to identify an individual on its own, but it was sufficient to be entered into the national database system. The expectation at the time was cautious. Partial profiles often lead to partial matches, or no matches at all. But in this case, something unusual happened. The system returned no direct hit. For investigators, this result was both disappointing and significant. It meant that the offender was not in the existing criminal database. There was no immediate identification. But it also meant something else. The absence of a match did not eliminate possibility. It simply shifted the investigative strategy. Instead of asking who this person already known to law enforcement might be, investigators were now forced to ask who this person might be within the broader population. That shift changed everything. The case, which had been stalled in a state of ambiguity for years, now had a new direction. Not toward a name, but toward a method. Investigators began to consider alternative approaches to identifying the source of the DNA. One of the most important developments in forensic science at the time was the increasing ability to use familial DNA searching. This technique does not look for an exact match. Instead, it searches for partial similarities that may indicate a biological relationship between the unknown suspect and someone already in the system. This method, however, was complex and required careful legal and procedural consideration. It could not be used indiscriminately. It had to be targeted, justified, and controlled. In the Grim Sleeper case, approval was eventually granted for limited application of this technique. The first attempt did not yield immediate clarity. The system identified potential partial connections, but none that could be confidently used to narrow the suspect pool. Still, the process itself represented progress. For the first time in years, the investigation was actively moving forward in a direction that had not been possible before. Then came the moment that investigators would later describe not as dramatic, but as strangely ordinary. A small piece of discarded material, retrieved from an unrelated location, was collected during surveillance efforts. It was not taken from a crime scene, nor from an obvious suspect interaction. It was something far more mundane, something that would normally never carry investigative significance. But in this case, it contained biological material that could be analyzed. The sample was processed, and the resulting DNA profile was compared against the partial profile from the original crime scene evidence. This time, the result was different. There was a familial link. Not a direct identification, but a connection that suggested the unknown suspect had a relative within reach of existing databases. For investigators, this was the turning point. Because while an unknown individual could remain hidden indefinitely, a network of relatives often leaves traces that can be followed. From this moment onward, the investigation shifted into a more focused phase. Surveillance operations were carefully initiated. Public records were reviewed. Family connections were mapped. Investigators began the slow process of narrowing down potential individuals who might be linked to the DNA profile. This process required patience and discretion. It was not about making assumptions, but about eliminating possibilities one by one. Each step brought the investigation closer to a manageable scope. During this phase, Lonnie Franklin Jr. entered the field of interest. At first, he was not singled out. He was one name among many in a broader dataset of individuals connected through familial links. But as investigators refined their analysis, patterns began to converge. His proximity to the areas where incidents had occurred. His age relative to the timeline of the crimes. His presence within the geographic and social landscape of South Los Angeles during the relevant periods. None of these factors alone were conclusive. But together, they formed a narrowing corridor of probability. To confirm or eliminate suspicion, investigators needed a direct DNA sample. This requirement created a new challenge. Unlike earlier stages of forensic analysis, this step could not rely solely on stored evidence. It required a current biological sample from the individual under consideration. Surveillance teams were deployed with careful instructions. The goal was not confrontation, but collection. Investigators observed Franklin's movements, his daily routines, and his interactions with the environment. They waited for an opportunity where a discarded item could legally and ethically provide the necessary material. That opportunity eventually came in an unexpected form. A piece of discarded food, left behind in a public space, was recovered and processed. The sample contained usable DNA. When compared against the crime scene profiles, the result was a match. For the first time in decades, the Grim Sleeper investigation had a direct biological connection to a living individual. This moment did not immediately resolve the case, but it transformed it. What had once been an abstract pattern now had a tangible anchor. The investigation was no longer searching in the dark. It had identified a focal point. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was no longer just a name in a database. He had become a subject of active investigation. From this point forward, every aspect of his life became relevant. His movements, his history, his associations, his routines. Surveillance intensified. Evidence was compiled. And the long process of building a prosecutable case began. But even at this stage, investigators remained cautious. DNA evidence, while powerful, required context. It had to be supported by additional findings, documentation, and corroboration to withstand legal scrutiny in court. Still, the discovery had fundamentally changed the emotional tone of the investigation. For years, detectives had worked under the weight of uncertainty. Now, for the first time, uncertainty had begun to narrow. The invisible had become visible. The unknown had begun to take shape. And somewhere in South Los Angeles, a man who had lived for decades without public suspicion was now connected, through the smallest fragments of biological trace, to a series of crimes that had haunted an entire city. The investigation had not yet reached its conclusion. But it had crossed a threshold that could no longer be reversed. By the time Lonnie Franklin Jr. became a central figure in the Grim Sleeper investigation, the case had already existed in multiple lifetimes of police work. It had begun in an era of limited forensic capability, survived years of stagnation, and then re-emerged in a period of technological transformation. What remained constant throughout all those phases was uncertainty. But now, for the first time, uncertainty had a direction. The transition from unidentified pattern to identified suspect did not simplify the case. Instead, it intensified every aspect of it. Once Franklin entered the investigative focus, the entire structure of the inquiry shifted from abstract analysis to targeted scrutiny. Every available resource was redirected toward understanding not only whether he was responsible, but how deeply his life was entangled with the series of crimes stretching back decades. Investigators approached this phase with caution. DNA evidence had provided a critical link, but it was not treated as the sole foundation of the case. In serious homicide investigations, especially those involving potential serial offenses, corroboration is essential. Forensic science can indicate connection, but narrative context must establish behavior, opportunity, and consistency. The first step was to reconstruct Franklin's timeline. Detectives began building a detailed profile of his movements over the relevant decades. Employment records, residential history, known associations, and public records were carefully reviewed. What emerged was a picture of a man who had remained consistently embedded in South Los Angeles for most of the period under investigation. He had worked for the city in sanitation services, a role that placed him across multiple neighborhoods on a regular basis. This detail was significant not because it implied guilt, but because it provided access and mobility within the exact geographic zones where many of the crimes had occurred. His occupation meant that his presence in various areas would not have drawn attention. He could move through the city without appearing unusual. Investigators also examined his personal life. Franklin maintained family relationships, interacted with neighbors, and appeared outwardly stable. There were no obvious public indicators that would have immediately suggested violent behavior. This contrast between outward normalcy and forensic implication created one of the central tensions of the investigation. As surveillance increased, detectives focused on observing patterns rather than assumptions. Franklin's daily routines were documented. His movements were tracked within legal boundaries. His interactions in public spaces were noted. Nothing in his immediate behavior suggested overt criminal activity, yet the weight of accumulated forensic evidence required continued scrutiny. At the same time, investigators revisited old case files with renewed purpose. Each homicide previously linked to the Grim Sleeper was re-examined in light of Franklin's emerging profile. Geographic correlations were reassessed. Victim selection patterns were compared against his known locations and mobility. The goal was not simply to confirm presence, but to establish consistency between opportunity and outcome. One of the most challenging aspects of this phase was the temporal gap between early and later crimes. The apparent pause in activity from the late 1980s to the early 2000s required careful interpretation. Investigators had to consider multiple possibilities. Was this truly a cessation of activity, or a period in which crimes had gone undetected or unconnected? Did the offender change methods, relocate, or temporarily reduce frequency while remaining active in other ways? Franklin's continued presence in the same general region during this entire timeline became a point of focus. If he was the offender, the pause in visible activity would need explanation, not through geography, but through behavior. Investigators also began interviewing individuals who had known Franklin socially or professionally. These interviews were conducted carefully, without revealing full details of the investigation. The objective was to gather behavioral observations, not conclusions. People who had interacted with him over the years described him in ways that did not immediately align with violent criminal stereotypes. He was often remembered as quiet, reserved, or unremarkable. This lack of external indication did not weaken the case, but it complicated it. Serial offenders often exist in contradiction to expectations. The absence of visible warning signs does not equate to absence of behavior. As the investigation progressed, forensic analysts continued strengthening the DNA comparison work. Additional samples were reviewed, and previously unconnected evidence sets were re-evaluated. Each confirmed or partial match added structural reinforcement to the case. The pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to interpret as coincidence. However, building a prosecutable case required more than biological correlation. Prosecutors needed to demonstrate that Franklin was not only connected to the DNA evidence, but also to the specific circumstances of the crimes. This meant establishing presence, opportunity, and behavioral plausibility across multiple incidents. To achieve this, investigators created detailed reconstructions of known victim timelines. They mapped the last known movements of victims, the locations where they were last seen alive, and the environmental conditions surrounding those moments. These reconstructions were then compared against Franklin's known mobility and access during the same periods. What emerged was not a single definitive moment of convergence, but a repeated overlap of possibility. Time windows where he could have been present. Locations where he would have had access without drawing attention. Patterns that, when viewed collectively, strengthened the argument of consistent opportunity. Still, the investigation remained cautious. In high-profile homicide cases, especially those involving decades-old evidence, prosecutors must anticipate every possible challenge from defense scrutiny. Every inference had to be supported by documentation or forensic confirmation. As this process unfolded, the emotional weight of the case grew within the investigative team. Many of the detectives had spent years, even decades, following fragments of this case. The transition from unknown suspect to identified individual did not diminish the gravity of the crimes. Instead, it intensified the responsibility to ensure accuracy. The communities affected by the original crimes were also gradually becoming aware that progress was being made. Although details were limited due to the ongoing nature of the investigation, there was a growing sense that a long period of unresolved fear might finally be approaching a turning point. Meanwhile, Franklin continued his daily life under observation. From an external perspective, his routines appeared unchanged. This contrast between ordinary behavior and extraordinary implication remained one of the most psychologically complex aspects of the investigation. It forced investigators to confront the uncomfortable reality that violent behavior, when carefully concealed, can coexist with everyday normalcy for extended periods. As the case moved closer to formal legal action, the investigative focus narrowed further. Evidence was organized into thematic categories: forensic linkage, geographic correlation, temporal consistency, and behavioral plausibility. Each category reinforced the others, creating a multilayered structure of inference. At this stage, the investigation had reached a critical threshold. The question was no longer whether Franklin could be connected to the grim sleeper cases in a technical sense. The question had become whether the accumulated evidence was sufficient to withstand courtroom scrutiny and establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Preparation for arrest and prosecution began quietly. Legal teams coordinated with investigators. Evidence chains were reviewed for integrity. Warrants were prepared with careful attention to procedural detail. Every step was designed to ensure that when action was taken, the resulting case would be as structurally sound as possible. Franklin, still under surveillance, remained unaware of the full extent of the investigation building around him. From the outside, nothing had changed. But within the investigative framework, the transition was already complete. The unknown offender had been identified. The pattern had been anchored to a person. The case had moved from theory to prosecution. What remained was execution of the final stage of the investigation, where evidence, years of work, and forensic discovery would converge into a formal confrontation with the justice system. There are moments in long investigations when years of uncertainty collapse into a single point of clarity, not because everything suddenly becomes simple, but because enough fragments finally align to make denial impossible. In the Grim Sleeper case, that moment did not arrive with noise or confrontation. It arrived quietly, through biological evidence that had survived time, neglect, and institutional limitation long enough to speak again. By the time the investigation reached its critical stage, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was no longer a peripheral subject. He had become the center of a carefully constructed evidentiary framework. Yet even then, investigators understood that suspicion alone was not enough. Serial homicide cases demand a level of certainty that can withstand legal precision, psychological scrutiny, and the defense's inevitable challenge to every assumption. The breakthrough began not as a revelation, but as confirmation. The DNA evidence that had first linked Franklin to the investigation was re-examined with heightened rigor. Independent analysts reviewed the methodology, ensuring that collection, preservation, and comparison protocols met the strictest standards. This was not merely procedural formality. In cases of this magnitude, the integrity of a single forensic step could determine whether decades of investigative work would result in conviction or collapse under legal challenge. Once confirmed, the focus shifted to strengthening the narrative structure around the forensic findings. Investigators needed to demonstrate not only that Franklin's DNA appeared in connection with multiple victims, but that the presence of that evidence aligned logically with known timelines, geographic access, and victim interactions. To achieve this, detectives returned once again to the reconstructed movement maps. These visualizations, built from decades of case data, now served a new purpose. Instead of illustrating unknown patterns, they were used to overlay Franklin's known locations and routines across the same spatial framework. What emerged was not a single point of convergence, but a repeated intersection of possibility. There were multiple instances where Franklin's documented presence in South Los Angeles overlapped with the last known locations of victims. These overlaps did not function as isolated coincidences. When viewed collectively, they created a pattern of access that reinforced the forensic findings. At the same time, investigators worked closely with prosecutors to prepare the legal architecture of the case. This stage required transforming scientific data into narrative coherence. DNA alone, while powerful, does not explain intent, opportunity, or sequence. It must be integrated into a broader framework of circumstantial evidence. To support this, additional investigative efforts focused on Franklin's personal history. His employment records confirmed long-term mobility across multiple neighborhoods. His residential stability placed him consistently within proximity of key incident areas. His lack of relocation during critical time periods eliminated alternative geographic explanations for repeated overlaps. Parallel to this, behavioral analysis was refined. Experts reviewed patterns from known serial offenders with similar victim profiles and operational environments. The goal was not to draw direct comparisons, but to understand whether Franklin's inferred behavior aligned with established criminological models. One of the most significant challenges during this phase was addressing the 14-year gap between confirmed clusters of activity. Defense arguments would inevitably focus on this interruption as evidence against continuity. Investigators, therefore, had to carefully contextualize this period. They examined whether gaps in reporting could be explained by limitations in detection, changes in methodology, or shifts in victim reporting patterns. What emerged was a complex, but consistent explanation. The absence of documented cases did not necessarily indicate absence of activity. Instead, it reflected limitations in investigative connectivity during that era. Without modern DNA databases and integrated cross-jurisdictional analysis, patterns could exist without being recognized as such. As the case structure solidified, attention turned toward operational execution. Surveillance teams maintained continuous observation of Franklin's movements. The objective was not confrontation, but confirmation. Investigators needed a final, direct DNA sample that could eliminate any remaining ambiguity. This phase required extreme precision. Legal standards governing evidence collection demanded that any sample obtained without consent had to be acquired in a manner consistent with lawful abandonment. The margin for procedural error was minimal. During this time, Franklin's behavior remained outwardly unchanged. He continued his daily routines, interacting with his environment in ways that appeared routine and unremarkable. This normalcy, however, no longer functioned as reassurance for investigators. Instead, it reinforced a central paradox of the case: that sustained concealment is often indistinguishable from ordinary life. The final confirmation arrived when investigators successfully obtained a discarded item linked directly to Franklin. The sample was processed under strict forensic conditions, and the resulting DNA profile was compared against the existing crime scene evidence. The match was definitive. For the investigative team, this moment did not produce celebration. It produced transition. Years of uncertainty, analysis, and reconstruction had reached a point where the evidentiary threshold for action had been met. The unknown offender was no longer unknown in a forensic sense. Identity, in legal terms, had been established. With confirmation secured, the investigation moved into its final operational phase. Arrest procedures were prepared in coordination with legal authorities. Every aspect of execution was designed to ensure procedural integrity. The objective was not only to apprehend Franklin, but to preserve the admissibility of every piece of evidence gathered over the course of the investigation. On the day of action, the process unfolded with controlled precision. Franklin was taken into custody without public disruption. There was no dramatic confrontation, no resistance that altered the structure of the operation. The arrest itself marked not an ending, but a transition from investigative reconstruction to judicial examination. Inside his residence, search teams executed a carefully planned warrant. The purpose was to identify and secure any additional evidence that might support the case. What they found added further complexity to the investigation. Photographic material, personal items, and other artifacts were collected for forensic analysis. Each item was catalogued, preserved, and entered into the evidentiary record. These materials did not replace the central role of DNA evidence, but they contributed to the broader contextual framework. They provided investigators and prosecutors with additional layers of corroboration that would later be presented in court. As Franklin was processed through the legal system, the investigation entered a new phase defined not by discovery, but by preparation for trial. Prosecutors now carried the responsibility of translating decades of investigative work into a coherent legal argument that could withstand defense scrutiny. For the communities affected by the case, the breakthrough represented something different. It marked the end of a long period of unresolved uncertainty. While legal proceedings were still ahead, the identification of a suspect provided a form of clarity that had been absent for years. For investigators, however, the breakthrough carried a more complex emotional weight. Resolution in serial homicide cases does not erase the memory of the victims or the duration of the investigation. Instead, it reframes them. What had once been a pattern without origin now had a defined source, but the consequences of that source remained unchanged. As the case transitioned into the judicial system, one truth became increasingly clear. The breakthrough was not the conclusion of the story. It was the moment when the story finally became structured enough to be judged. When the case against Lonnie Franklin Jr. entered the courtroom, it carried with it the weight of nearly 3 decades of unanswered questions. What had once been scattered fragments of violence across South Los Angeles had been reconstructed into a single narrative of prosecution. Yet the courtroom, unlike the investigative process, does not deal in patterns or probabilities. It demands structure, sequence, and certainty beyond reasonable doubt. The transition from investigation to trial marked a fundamental shift in how the case was presented. In the investigative phase, uncertainty could exist alongside progress. Leads could be explored without conclusion, and evidence could be contextualized without final interpretation. In court, however, every element had to be defined, defended, and connected in a way that left no essential gap unaddressed. Prosecutors began by establishing the framework of the case. They presented Franklin not as an abstract suspect, but as a central figure whose presence intersected with a series of murders spanning decades. The argument was not built on a single piece of evidence, but on convergence. DNA analysis, geographic overlap, victim timelines, and behavioral consistency were woven together into a structured narrative of repeated connection. The DNA evidence remained the foundation. In courtroom presentation, forensic experts explained in detail how biological samples collected from multiple crime scenes matched Franklin's genetic profile. The testimony emphasized the statistical strength of the match, explaining to the jury that the probability of coincidence was so remote that it effectively eliminated alternative explanations. Defense attorneys, however, challenged the interpretation of this evidence. They questioned collection procedures, storage conditions, and potential contamination risks. They also raised broader arguments about the reliability of cold case forensic reconstruction, particularly when evidence had been preserved over extended periods under varying conditions. This tension between scientific certainty and procedural challenge became one of the central dynamics of the trial. Each side was forced to engage not only with facts, but with interpretation. The jury was asked to evaluate not just what the evidence showed, but how it should be understood. Beyond DNA, prosecutors introduced geographic analysis. Maps were displayed showing the distribution of known victims over time. These visual reconstructions highlighted repeated clusters in South Los Angeles, areas that overlapped with Franklin's documented presence. The argument was not that presence alone indicated guilt, but that repeated opportunity in conjunction with forensic linkage reinforced a pattern of access that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Witness testimony added another layer. Investigators, who had worked on the case over many years, described the evolution of the investigation from isolated homicides to a connected series of events. Their testimony provided the jury with a sense of continuity, showing how individual cases had gradually converged into a single investigative framework. Family members of victims also appeared in court. Their testimony did not focus on technical evidence, but on absence. They described the impact of loss over time, the uncertainty that persisted for years, and the emotional weight of unresolved answers. These statements served to humanize the consequences of the crimes, grounding the legal proceedings in lived experience rather than abstract data. Franklin himself remained largely silent throughout the trial. His defense strategy focused on challenging the reliability of the evidence rather than offering alternative explanations for the crimes. This silence became a point of interpretation for the prosecution, who argued that the absence of a credible alternative narrative strengthened the forensic case. As the trial progressed, the complexity of presenting decades of investigative work within a structured legal framework became increasingly evident. Jurors were required to process not only technical forensic information, but also historical context, behavioral analysis, and procedural explanation. The weight of this responsibility was significant, as the final verdict would determine legal accountability for crimes spanning nearly 30 years. One of the most challenging aspects of the trial was addressing the temporal gap in activity attributed to the grim sleeper. The defense attempted to use this gap to suggest discontinuity, arguing that the lack of documented offenses during this period undermined claims of sustained behavior. Prosecutors countered this by presenting contextual explanations related to limitations in detection and reporting during the relevant years. They emphasized that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly in environments where investigative tools were limited. The jury was asked to consider not only what was recorded, but what may have gone undetected due to systemic constraints. As closing arguments approached, the structure of the case had become increasingly consolidated. Each component reinforced the others. DNA evidence provided direct biological linkage. Geographic analysis demonstrated repeated opportunity. Victim timelines established consistency in pattern. Witness testimony provided investigative continuity. Together, these elements formed a multidimensional argument that extended beyond any single point of proof. The defense maintained its focus on procedural doubt, emphasizing potential weaknesses in evidence handling and interpretation. However, as the trial neared its conclusion, the cumulative weight of the prosecution's case became increasingly difficult to dismantle without introducing equally compelling alternative explanations, which were not provided. When the jury retired to deliberate, the atmosphere in the courtroom reflected the gravity of what had been presented. This was not a case defined by a single act or moment, but by an extended pattern of violence reconstructed through decades of evidence. The responsibility placed on the jurors was to determine whether that reconstruction met the legal threshold for guilt beyond reasonable doubt. After deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was found guilty of multiple counts of murder, including the killing of at least 10 women and 1 teenage girl. The conviction represented the formal legal recognition of a pattern that investigators had spent decades attempting to understand. Following the verdict, sentencing proceedings confirmed the severity of the judgment. Franklin was sentenced to death. The sentence reflected not only the individual crimes proven in court, but also the broader scope of harm established through the investigation. In the courtroom, reactions reflected a mixture of closure and emotional exhaustion. For families of victims, the verdict represented acknowledgement after years of uncertainty. It did not restore what had been lost, but it provided a formal conclusion to a long period of unanswered questions. For investigators and prosecutors, the verdict marked the completion of an extraordinary investigative journey. A case that had begun with fragmented reports in the 1980s had been carried through decades of technological change, institutional shifts, and forensic advancement, ultimately reaching a resolution that had once seemed unreachable. Yet even in the presence of legal resolution, the case retained complexity. Not all victims had been identified. Not all questions had been answered. And not every aspect of Franklin's life during the years of suspected activity had been fully reconstructed. Justice, in this context, was not absolute closure. It was accountability within the limits of available evidence. As the proceedings concluded, the courtroom slowly emptied. What remained was the formal record of conviction, the documented acknowledgement of loss, and the structured conclusion of a case that had once existed only as a series of disconnected tragedies. But outside the courtroom, in the neighborhoods where the events had originally unfolded, the meaning of justice would continue to evolve in quieter, more personal ways. After the verdict was delivered and the courtroom emptied, the Grim Sleeper case did not end. It simply changed form. What had once been an active investigation, then a legal proceeding, now became something more permanent and more difficult to define, a memory embedded in the city itself. In South Los Angeles, where the events had unfolded over decades, justice did not arrive as a single moment of closure. It arrived as a slow adjustment to a reality that could no longer be denied. For the families of victims, the aftermath was not marked by celebration. It was marked by exhaustion. Years of uncertainty had already taken a toll that could not be reversed by a verdict. Some families had spent decades waiting for answers about what happened to their loved ones. Others had lived with partial knowledge, filling gaps with imagination that was often more painful than fact. The trial provided structure to that uncertainty, but structure is not the same as healing. Even with conviction secured, many families described a sense of incompleteness. They now knew who was responsible in a legal sense, but the emotional landscape remained fragmented. The absence of their loved ones could not be resolved through sentencing or judicial recognition. In the neighborhoods where many of the crimes had occurred, the aftermath took on a different character. South Los Angeles had already lived with the presence of fear long before the case reached resolution. But after the conviction, there was a subtle shift in how people processed that fear. It was no longer directed toward an unknown figure moving invisibly through the community. It had a face, a name, and a documented history. That shift brought relief, but also reflection. Residents began to revisit years of collective uncertainty, reconsidering moments that had once been dismissed as coincidence or misfortune. Conversations emerged about missed opportunities, overlooked warnings, and the limitations of institutional response during the earlier phases of the investigation. For law enforcement, the aftermath of the case became a subject of internal evaluation. The investigation had ultimately succeeded, but it had also exposed structural limitations that had allowed the crimes to continue undetected for so long. The gaps in forensic technology during the early years, the lack of integrated databases, and the fragmented nature of interdepartmental communication all contributed to the delay in identifying the offender. These reflections were not framed as failures of individuals, but as systemic challenges. The Grim Sleeper case became a reference point in discussions about how serial offenses can remain hidden within urban environments when detection systems are not fully connected or sufficiently resourced. One of the most significant lessons drawn from the case was the importance of evidence preservation. The fact that DNA samples collected in the 1980s could later be reanalyzed with advanced technology, was central to the eventual breakthrough. Without that preserved material, the case might have remained unresolved indefinitely. This realization influenced changes in how evidence was stored, catalogued, and re-evaluated in other cold cases. The idea that unresolved investigations could benefit from future technological advancements became a guiding principle in forensic strategy. At the same time, the case also influenced public awareness of how certain victims are treated within investigative systems. Many of the women connected to the Grim Sleeper case came from marginalized communities. Their social circumstances had, in some instances, affected the urgency with which early reports were pursued. This aspect of the case prompted broader discussions about equity in investigative prioritization and the need to ensure that victim status is not influenced by socioeconomic background. In academic and criminological circles, the case became a subject of extensive study. Analysts examined not only the behavioral profile of Lonnie Franklin Jr., but also the environmental conditions that allowed his crimes to remain undetected for such an extended period. The concept of invisibility within visibility became central to these discussions, describing how individuals can operate within plain sight without triggering immediate suspicion due to social familiarity and systemic blind spots. The psychological impact of the case also extended to investigators who had worked on it over many years. For those who had followed the case through its most uncertain phases, the resolution brought a complex mixture of relief and reflection. Many described the experience of carrying unresolved cases as a persistent background presence in their professional lives. Seeing the case concluded provided closure in a professional sense, but also prompted renewed awareness of the emotional weight carried by long-term investigations. In the years following the conviction, the name Lonnie Franklin Jr. became firmly associated with one of the most extensive serial homicide investigations in Los Angeles history. However, over time, the focus of public memory began to shift away from the perpetrator and back toward the victims. Memorial efforts, community discussions, and renewed attention to unsolved aspects of the case helped recenter the narrative around those who had been lost. Not all questions were answered by the trial. Several victims remained unidentified, their names still absent from official records. These unresolved identities became a continued focus for forensic analysts and advocacy groups, who worked to restore individuality to those who had been reduced to evidence in earlier phases of the investigation. The passage of time after the conviction also revealed how deeply the case had affected collective memory within the city. For many residents, especially those who had lived through the decades when the crimes occurred, the case represented a period of uncertainty that shaped how they understood safety, trust, and institutional response. Even after legal closure, the emotional landscape of the case continued to evolve. In some ways, the conviction marked the beginning of a different kind of processing, one in which the focus shifted from identifying the offender to understanding the broader implications of how such a long series of crimes could occur without earlier resolution. In reflecting on the aftermath, investigators and analysts often returned to a central question: how could someone live an ordinary public life while allegedly carrying out a sustained pattern of violence over decades? This question did not yield a simple answer, because it intersected with broader themes of perception, assumption, and the limits of observational awareness in densely populated urban environments. The Grim Sleeper case ultimately became more than a criminal investigation. It became a study in how patterns of violence can exist beneath the surface of everyday life, how evidence can remain dormant until technology catches up to memory, and how justice, when delayed, transforms not only legal outcomes, but collective understanding. In the end, what remained was not only the record of conviction, but the layered recognition that every case extends beyond its resolution. It continues in the lives of those affected, in the systems that adapt in response, and in the quiet persistence of unanswered questions that survive even after the courtroom doors have closed. When a case like the Grim Sleeper reaches its final legal outcome, it can appear, from a distance, as if the story has reached its conclusion. A suspect has been identified, a verdict has been delivered, and a sentence has been imposed. The structure of justice, at least in formal terms, is complete. But in reality, cases that span decades of violence do not end at the moment of conviction. They continue to exist in memory, in unresolved questions, and in the lingering psychological imprint left on communities, investigators, and families. The story of Lonnie Franklin Jr. is not only a story about a serial offender. It is also a story about time itself, and how time interacts with systems of detection, memory, and accountability. The most unsettling aspect of the case was not only the scale of the crimes, but the duration of invisibility. 4 years, violence occurred in a pattern that was only partially visible, fragmented across reports, jurisdictions, and changing investigative methods. It was only when technology advanced and old evidence was revisited that the structure beneath those fragments became clear. This delayed clarity raises a fundamental question that continues to echo beyond the courtroom. How many patterns remain unrecognized because the tools required to see them have not yet fully matured? The Grim Sleeper case demonstrated that resolution is not always a matter of missing information, but sometimes a matter of missing capability. Evidence existed long before it could be fully understood. In examining Franklin's life after conviction, what becomes most striking is not the moment of exposure, but the length of time during which exposure did not occur. He lived for decades within ordinary social structures, performing routine roles, maintaining relationships, and existing in environments where suspicion was not immediately triggered. This duality forces a confrontation with the limits of perception. It challenges the assumption that extraordinary behavior always produces visible disruption in real time. The victims in this case, meanwhile, remain at the center of its meaning. While the legal system focuses on the identification and punishment of the offender, the deeper narrative remains anchored in the lives that were interrupted. Each victim represented a distinct trajectory that was cut short at different points, in different contexts, under similar patterns of violence. Their absence is not only statistical. It is relational, affecting families, communities, and personal histories that extend far beyond the investigative record. In the years following the conviction, efforts to preserve and restore the identities of victims became an essential part of the ongoing legacy of the case. Some names had been identified and publicly acknowledged, while others remained unknown, preserved only through forensic reference numbers and partial records. This incomplete restoration reflects a broader truth about historical violence. Legal resolution does not automatically produce narrative completion. For investigators who worked on the case across multiple decades, the aftermath brought a mixture of closure and reflection. Many described the experience as a long process of accumulation, where small pieces of evidence gathered over time eventually formed a coherent structure. Yet even with that structure in place, there remained an awareness that the work was shaped by timing as much as effort. Had forensic technology not advanced, had DNA preservation not been maintained, had investigative continuity not been preserved across institutional transitions, the outcome might have been different. This recognition has influenced how modern cold case investigations are approached. The Grim Sleeper case is now frequently referenced in discussions about the importance of long-term evidence storage, interagency data sharing, and the need for sustained attention to cases that do not yield immediate results. It demonstrates that time does not erase evidence. It often simply waits for the conditions in which that evidence can be understood. At the community level, the case also reshaped conversations about vulnerability and visibility. Many of the victims came from environments where social and economic instability intersected with reduced institutional protection. This reality has led to increased awareness of how certain populations may experience delayed investigative response, not due to intentional neglect, but due to systemic prioritization patterns that have since been critically examined. The psychological dimension of the case also extends beyond the individuals directly involved. For a city like Los Angeles, which has long been shaped by both visibility and fragmentation, the realization that a single offender could operate across decades without detection created a lasting imprint on collective awareness. It reinforced the idea that danger does not always present itself in recognizable forms, and that familiarity does not necessarily equate to safety. Yet it is important not to reduce the case solely to its structural implications. At its core, it remains a collection of human lives, interrupted and remembered. The forensic evidence, the investigative maps, and the courtroom proceedings all serve a purpose, but they exist to support a more fundamental recognition that each victim was a person whose life had meaning independent of the circumstances of their death. In reflecting on Lonnie Franklin Jr. himself, the case does not offer psychological simplicity. There is no single explanation that fully captures the contradiction between outward normalcy and alleged sustained violence. Instead, the case presents a reminder that human behavior can exist in layers that are not immediately visible to those around it. This does not reduce accountability, but it does complicate assumptions about detection and recognition. As time continues to pass, the Grim Sleeper case gradually shifts from active legal history into broader criminal memory. It becomes part of training material for investigators, part of academic study in criminology, and part of public discourse on justice delayed. But for those most directly affected, it remains personal, anchored in specific names, specific places, and specific absences that cannot be generalized. The final reflection of this case is not a single conclusion, but a set of enduring questions. How can systems improve detection without losing sensitivity to context? How can evidence be preserved in ways that anticipate future technological capability? How can communities be better supported so that vulnerability does not become invisibility? And perhaps most importantly, how can justice be understood not only as the act of conviction, but as the long process of restoring recognition to those whose stories might otherwise fade into fragmented record? The Grim Sleeper case does not offer closure in the emotional sense. It offers understanding in the structural sense. It shows how a pattern can exist beneath decades of daily life, how evidence can wait silently for the right moment, and how justice, when it arrives, is always shaped by the time it took to reach it. In the end, what remains is not only the memory of the crimes or the identity of the offender, but the recognition that every unresolved case is also a record of time itself, waiting for the moment when it can finally be seen clearly. Long after the conviction, when the case files have been archived and the headlines have faded into digital memory, what remains of the Grim Sleeper story is not movement, but stillness. It is the kind of stillness that settles over systems after they have exhausted every available tool of explanation. The investigation ends on paper, but in lived reality it continues in quieter forms, in reflection, in procedural reform, and in the way future cases are interpreted through the lens it left behind. In the official record, Lonnie Franklin Jr. is defined by legal language, multiple counts of murder, life history reconstructed through forensic evidence, sentencing that concluded a decades-long investigation. But beyond the legal framing, the case occupies a different space in the collective understanding of crime in Los Angeles. It exists as a reminder that patterns can remain hidden in plain sight for far longer than intuition suggests possible. The closure of the case did not erase the years of uncertainty that preceded it. For investigators, those years remain part of institutional memory. They are studied not only for what was ultimately discovered, but for what was missed, delayed, or fragmented along the way. Every cold case unit that examines serial violence in urban environments eventually encounters the Grim Sleeper as a reference point, not because it is unique in brutality, but because it is illustrative of systemic blind spots that can persist even in heavily monitored cities. One of the most lasting impacts of the case lies in forensic practice. The preservation of DNA evidence across decades proved decisive. Without it, the connection between early and later crimes would likely have remained speculative. This realization has influenced how evidence is stored in modern investigations, with increased emphasis on long-term viability and cross-generational utility. Evidence rooms are no longer seen as static repositories, but as future-facing archives that may yield answers many years after collection. Yet even as science advanced, the human dimension of the case resisted full resolution. The families of victims continue to live with partial answers. Some received confirmation of identity and cause of death. Others continue to wait for full recognition, as unidentified remains are gradually matched through ongoing forensic work. This process does not operate on the same timeline as public attention. It continues quietly, often outside of media visibility, driven by incremental technological improvement and sustained investigative commitment. In South Los Angeles, where many of the events originally occurred, the passage of time has reshaped the physical environment. Buildings have changed, streets have been repaved, and neighborhoods have evolved in ways that no longer resemble the conditions of the 1980s or early 2000s. Yet memory does not follow infrastructure. For those who lived through the period of uncertainty, the case remains anchored to specific locations, specific intersections, and specific absences that cannot be overwritten by redevelopment. Community response to the case over time has shifted from fear to reflection. In earlier years, the unknown identity of the offender created a diffuse sense of vulnerability. After conviction, that fear was replaced by a more complex understanding of how long-term violence can exist without immediate detection. This awareness has contributed to ongoing discussions about community engagement with law enforcement, reporting systems, and the importance of visibility for marginalized populations. Within criminology, the case has become part of a broader study of serial offending in urban environments. Researchers examine it not only for behavioral patterns, but for environmental conditions that allowed repeated offenses to go undetected for extended periods. The interaction between socioeconomic instability, limited surveillance infrastructure, and fragmented investigative systems is analyzed as a case study in how structural factors can influence the duration of criminal activity. At the same time, caution is exercised in interpretation. While structural analysis is important, it does not replace the individual accountability established in court. The legal conclusion remains clear. The responsibility for the crimes rests with the individual convicted. What the broader analysis provides is context, not mitigation. It helps explain how such patterns can persist, but it does not diminish the established findings of guilt. For those who worked on the case directly, there is often a separation between professional closure and emotional closure. Professionally, the case reached its endpoint with conviction and sentencing. Emotionally, however, the process of working through decades of violent history leaves an imprint that does not resolve in the same way. Investigators describe this as a form of accumulated memory, where certain cases remain present in thought long after they have been officially concluded. The psychological complexity of the Grim Sleeper case also lies in its contradiction between visibility and recognition. The offender was not hidden in isolation. He existed within a functioning urban environment, interacting with systems, institutions, and communities that did not perceive him as a threat. This challenges conventional assumptions about how danger is identified. It demonstrates that recognition is not solely dependent on proximity, but on interpretation of behavior across time. In reflecting on the case, one of the most persistent questions is not about how it ended, but about how it persisted. The answer does not rest in a single failure or oversight. It rests in accumulation of limited technology, of fragmented communication, of jurisdictional boundaries, and of social invisibility that affected how certain victims were initially categorized within investigative priorities. Each factor alone was not decisive. Together, They created a space in which the pattern could exist without immediate detection. The eventual resolution of the case demonstrates that even long-standing investigative stagnation can be overcome, but it also underscores that resolution is often dependent on timing as much as effort. The evidence existed long before it could be fully interpreted. The connection existed before it could be recognized. What changed was not the past itself, but the ability to read it differently. As the years continue to pass, the Grim Sleeper case becomes less a current event and more a structural lesson embedded in the history of forensic investigation. It informs how future cases are approached, how evidence is preserved, and how long-term patterns are evaluated. It also serves as a reminder that justice, while capable of reaching delayed conclusions, does not operate outside the constraints of time. The final silence of the case is not absence. It is the presence of completion within a system that has done all it can with the information available to it. What remains beyond that is interpretation, memory, and the continued effort to ensure that similar patterns, if they emerge again, are recognized earlier, connected faster, and resolved with greater immediacy. In the end, the Grim Sleeper case does not end with a sense of finality that erases what came before. It ends with awareness. Awareness that justice can arrive, but not always on time. Awareness that visibility can fail even in densely populated environments. An awareness that every solved case carries within it the memory of the time when it was still unsolved. And so, what remains is not silence as emptiness, but silence as understanding.